You know, that interview with former President Goodluck Jonathan really got me thinking.
Yeah.
He seemed really worried about Nigerian democracy.
Mm-hmm.
He even said something was threatening to undermine the very foundation. I mean, that's a pretty stark warning.
It is, coming from a former head of state. You're right. It's definitely something to pay attention to. Nigeria's had its share of instability. Their democracy is still quite young, relatively speaking.
Right. And he seemed especially concerned about the judiciary and how some court judgments, especially in these political cases, are impacting things.
Yeah.
Why is the judiciary so central here?
Well, because in a democracy, especially a young democracy, the judiciary is really the kind of the bedrock, you know?
Okay.
They're the ones who are supposed to uphold the Constitution, make sure everybody's following the rules, and be a neutral party, basically. So when there are concerns about their actions, you know, it raises some red flags.
Yeah, for sure. And he pointed to a particular Supreme Court ruling that he found troubling, this case about the National Party chairman being suspended.
Oh, right. The upside down ruling. It's been interesting to see that play out in the media.
Yeah.
Jonathan made a good point, I think, when he said, you know, imagine if the head of a department at a university could just, like, overrule the vice chancellor.
Yeah, that does seem a little backwards.
Right. So in this case, you had a ward chairman who's, like, the lowest level of party leadership.
Okay.
And they were able to suspend the national chairman, who's, you know, top dog.
Wow. So it really flipped the power structure.
Exactly. And, I mean, what message does that send, right? Like, what does that say about, you know, the separation of powers? What does that say about the potential for abuse? You know, it raises some big questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And has this happened before? Like, what's the history of this kind of judicial involvement in Nigeria?
Well, it's a good question because Nigeria's got this history of judicial activism. Sometimes it's been seen as, like, protecting democracy.
Right.
Other times people say it's overreach, so it's a bit of a gray area.
And where does this ruling fall, you think?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Jonathan certainly seemed to think it was a step too far and worried about the implications, not just for the parties, but for governing as a whole.
You can imagine how it would be just chaos,
Yeah,
right?
it could be.
If anyone could just overrule their superiors.
Right. Decisions would never get made. You'd have all these power struggles spilling out into the open, and it'd just be a mess.
Exactly.
And that's precisely what Jonathan was warning against, you know? He argued that this kind of ruling could actually paralyze these parties and keep them from actually governing.
So it sounds like this is about more than just this one ruling.
Yeah, definitely.
Jonathan seemed to be getting at something bigger here. Something about the overall political climate. I mean, he even called it Christmas for lawyers at one point.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty funny, but also kind of scary at the same time. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's a colorful way of putting it, that's for sure. I think he's getting at this this tendency to run to the courts every time there's a political disagreement. You know, instead of just talking things out, trying to find some common ground, it's like litigation has become the default setting.
Right. And I can see how that wouldn't be healthy for a democracy, right?
Exactly. And it can backfire, too.
How so?
Well, for one thing, people start to lose faith.
Then
The whole system, you know, the political process, even the courts themselves, they just see politicians fighting it out in courtrooms instead of, you know, actually governing.
And I guess whoever's got the deepest pockets has a big advantage.
Oh, absolutely. The more money you have, the longer you can keep those lawyers on retainer, file those motions, just completely bury your opponent in paperwork. It's a way to silence dissent, basically.
And what about the impact on the parties themselves?
Oh, it's devastating. It just breeds this culture of infighting and mistrust.
Instead of
working together trying to find solutions, they're constantly at each other's throats.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like you're so busy fighting amongst yourselves, you forget what you're supposed to be doing in the first place.
Right. It's like, who's going to run the country while you're all tied up in court? And in a young democracy like Nigeria, that's especially worrisome.
Because they're still figuring things out.
Exactly. They need to develop their own ways of resolving conflict, their own political culture, and if they become too reliant on the courts to do it for them, well...
It's like they're short-circuiting the process.
Exactly. They're not really learning how to work through these things on their own. And that's what Jonathan was trying to highlight with his call for reforms.
Oh, right. He talked about the need for reforms, both in the courts and in the parties themselves. What kinds of things did he have in mind?
Well, he didn't really get into specifics, but I think what he's suggesting is that they need to look at the rules of the game.
Okay.
Like, how do these political parties operate? How do they handle internal disputes? And then on the judicial side, how can they make sure that the courts are impartial, that they're not being used as political weapons?
So, like, maybe the parties could get better at resolving their own disputes internally.
Exactly. Like, what if they set up clear procedures for mediation, arbitration, things like that? Or maybe they could give more power to respected figures within the party to help mediate conflicts. You know, people who are seen as neutral, who everyone trusts.
And on the judicial side, how do you safeguard against those political influences?
Well, there are a few things they could look at. Some people have suggested reforming the way judges are appointed.
Makes sense.
Make it more transparent, less prone to political pressure. Others have talked about the need for better training for judges, you know, making sure they understand the complexities of political cases and how to handle them fairly and impartially.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's all about finding that balance, isn't it?
It really is.
Like, you need a strong judiciary, but you don't want it to stifle political discourse.
It's a delicate dance.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
So where does this all leave us then? We've been talking about this tension between needing a strong independent judiciary, but also not wanting them to get too involved in politics. It's a tough needle to thread.
You've put your finger right on it. You know, this is something that all democracies grapple with, especially newer ones like Nigeria that are still finding their way.
Right, because if the courts get too powerful, it's like, what's the point of having a democracy?
Right, exactly. And that's, I think, what Jonathan was getting at with this warning. He's basically saying, look, if we're not careful, Nigerian politics could devolve into this, like, legal free-for-all.
Where every disagreement ends up in court.
Right, and then nothing gets done. And people just get disillusioned with the whole system.
Which is the last thing Nigeria needs.
Exactly.
So it seems like there's a lot riding on Nigeria figuring this out.
I think so. I mean, it's about more than just Nigeria, right? It's about the future of democracy, especially in these young democracies. They have to get this balance right.
So what can people do? How do we make sure that these democracies succeed?
Well, it starts with being aware of the challenges, and then I think it's about being engaged, staying informed. Don't just sit on the sidelines and complain. Get involved.
Right. Hold your leaders accountable.
Exactly. And demand better. Demand a system that actually works for everyone.
Yeah.
That's how we build a better future.
Well said. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. This is such an important topic, and I hope our listeners will continue to think about these issues and what they can do to help strengthen democracy, both in Nigeria and around the world.